Imagine building a $1 billion solar power plant in the middle of the Nevada desert. 10,000 giant mirrors, a massive tower, a revolutionary technology designed to produce electricity even after the sun goes down. The US government backed it with $700 million loan. The project was supposed to power around 75,000 homes. It looked like the future of the American energy. But then, the technology started failing. The plant shut down. Its major customer walked away. The company behind it filed a bankruptcy, and hundreds of millions of dollars in debt remained. For a project that was supposed to demonstrate the future of the solar energy, Crescent Dunes was starting to look like a billion-dollar mistake. But here's the part that makes this story even more interesting. It did not stay dead. After years of problem, the abandoned-looking facility came back to life. So what actually went wrong at the Crescent Dunes? Why did a project backed by a US government struggle so badly? And how did this failed solar experiment manage to return to operation? This is the story of Crescent Dunes. Our story begins in 2011, deep in the Nevada desert. At first glance, there was nothing particularly unusual about the location. But engineers had something extraordinary planned for this empty stretch of the land. Instead of covering the desert with ordinary solar panels, they would build something completely different, a massive field containing approximately 10,000 mirrors. These mirrors, known as heliostars, would attract the sun throughout the day and reflect its energy toward the central tower. And that tower was the heart of the entire project. The concentrated sunlight would create enormous amounts of the heat. That heat would then be transferred into the molten salt, and this is where Crescent Dunes was supposed to have an advantage over the traditional solar farms. Solar panels generally produce electricity when the sun is shining, but Crescent Dunes was designed to store the thermal energy. That meant the plant could potentially continue generating electricity even after the sunset. In theory, this was not simply an adult solar farm. It was supposed to be a new generation of renewable energy, a solar plant that could behave more like a traditional power station. But revolutionary technology comes with a major problem. What happens when the technology does not work as planned? The project was not being funded by a small startup alone. The US government was willing to take a major financial gamble on it. Crescent Dunes received a $700 million loan guaranteed from the US Department of Energy to support the development and construction. At the time, it was one of the largest government-backed loan guarantees of the kind. Private investors also contributed additional funding. Altogether, the project's development cost approached $1 billion. The message was clear. America was betting heavily on this technology. If Crescent Dunes succeeded, it could become a blueprint of the large-scale solar power plants across the country. Thousands of mirrors would capture sunlight. Molten salt would store the heat. Steam would drive turbines, and electricity would flow to Nevada homes. Everything sounded promising. But construction would soon reveal something the original plans could not completely predict. The Nevada desert had other ideas. Nevada is famous for its intense desert environment, extreme heat, large temperature swings, and harsh operating conditions. As construction progressed, engineers began encountering serious technical challenges. The enormous system of the mirror had to be precisely assembled and calibrated. Every mirror needed to track the sun correctly. A small problem across thousands of mirrors would become a massive engineering headache. And then there was this central tower. The concentrated sunlight created extraordinarily high temperatures, but the system also needed to maintain the right operating conditions to produce electricity efficiently. Components began experiencing problems. Mechanical systems struggled. Construction and commissioning took longer than expected, and the complexity of the technology was becoming increasingly obvious. This was not a field of simple solar panels. It was an enormous mechanical and thermal port system spread across the desert. Thousands of moving meters, a giant solar tower, molten salt, steam turbines, pipes, ordered systems, and thousands of components that had to work together. And when something went wrong, the entire system could be affected. But the biggest test was still waiting. The plant had to actually operate. Crescent Dunes began commercial operation in 2015. For the people behind the project, this should have been the moment when years of investment finally paid off. But instead, the plant entered one of the most difficult periods of its history. In 2016, a leak involving the molten salt storage system forced the facility to shut down. And this was not a short maintenance break. The plant remained offline for roughly a year. Think about what that meant. $1 billion facility, built to demonstrate revolutionary solar technology, was sitting there unable to generate electricity. Eventually, the plant reopened in July 2017. But the problems were not one, because even if the plant could generate electricity, there was another question. Could it generate electricity cheaply enough for someone to want it? This may have been Crescent Dunes' biggest problem. Its electricity was expensive. Reports indicated that NV Energy, the project's solar customer, was paying around $135 per megawatt hour under this project's economics. Meanwhile, conventional solar power had become dramatically cheaper. In many cases, traditional utility-scale solar projects were producing electricity for less than $30 per megawatt hour. That created a brutal economic problem. Yes, Crescent Dunes had an important advantage: its molten salt system designed to store energy and allow electricity generation beyond daylight hours. But the question was simple: was that advantage worth enormous additional cost? For enemy energy, the answer eventually became no. In 2019, enemy energy terminated its contacts with the facility. And suddenly, Crescent Dunes had an enormous problem. It had a power plant, but no major customer. Without a customer purchasing its electricity, the economics of the facility became even more worse. The plant eventually stopped generating electricity for an extended period. And even a month in remained offline meant more financial pressure. The company behind the project, Renewable Energy, was now facing a devastating combination: technical problems, high operating cost, lost revenue, and enormous debt. Then came the moment that seemed to confirm the project's failure. July 2020, Renewable Energy filed a bankruptcy. The project had received hundreds of millions of dollars in government-backed financing. Reports indicated that the company still owed more than $400 million to U.S. Department of the Energy. A project that had once been described as a symbol of America's clean energy future was now trapped in the bankruptcy proceedings. For many observers, the conclusion seemed obvious: Crescent Dunes had failed. But then, something unexpected happened. In 2021, the story took another dramatic turn. The Crescent Dunes facility returned to the operation. According to the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the plant resumed full operation and electricity production in July 2021. After years of shutdowns, technical problems, and bankruptcy, the giant solar tower was producing electricity again. So what changed? The plant's technology had undergone fixes and improvements, and Nevada's growing demand for electricity created a stronger need for available generation. The same facility that had once appeared to represent a technical failure now had another opportunity. It was not the same story anymore. The project had survived its biggest crisis, but its history raised a much bigger question. This was where the Crescent Dunes story became complicated. If you judge the project by its original expectations, the problems are difficult to ignore. The project cost around $1 billion. It experienced technical difficulties, it suffered lengthy shutdowns, its electricity was expensive, its customer eventually terminated its contract, and the company behind it entered bankruptcy. Those are serious failures, But there is another side to this story. The technology itself demonstrated something important. Solar energy can be combined with thermal storage to generate electricity beyond daylight hours. The challenge was not simply whether the concept could work. The challenge was whether it could work reliably and economically at its scale. And that distinction matters, because renewable energy is not just about building something that works. It has to work reliably, it has to be maintainable, and most importantly, it has to compete on cost. Crescent Dunes is more than the story of one solar power plant in the Nevada. It's less about technological innovation. When a country invests in a completely new technology, there is always a risk. Sometimes the technology succeeds immediately, sometimes it fails, and sometimes it fails first, teaches engineers valuable lesson, and then finds a second life. Crescent Dunes demonstrated both sides of that equation. It showed the enormous potential of the concentrated solar power plant. But it also demonstrated how difficult it can be to move an experimental technology from the laboratory into a massive commercial facility. The thousands of meters, the molten salt storage, the enormous tower, the complex mechanical system. Every part had to work together. And when even one major component failed, the consequences could cost millions. Today, Crescent Dunes stands as one of the most fascinating examples of the Americas experimental with large-scale renewable energy. Its history includes enormous ambition, government backing, engineering problems, financial collapse, and an unexpected comeback. The project that looked like $1 billion failure eventually returned to the operation. And perhaps that's the most interesting lesson of all. Innovation is not always a straight line. Sometimes the first attempt does not work. Sometimes the technology costs too much. Sometimes companies behind it collapse. But the knowledge gained from those failures can influence what comes next. Crescent Dunes may never become the revolution its creators originally imagined. But its story remains important because it shows exactly how difficult and unpredictable the transition to new energy technology can be. A billion-dollar experiment in Nevada desert, 10,000 meters, a tower surrounded by the concentrated sunlight, a technology that nearly collapsed, and a project that somehow came back. Crescent Dunes was not simply a solar farm. It was a gamble on the future, and its story is far from more. What do you think? Was Crescent Dunes a failure, a valuable experiment, or an example of technology arriving before its time? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the documentaries about America's biggest projects, technological failures, and the stories hiding behind the massive infrastructure, then subscribe for the next one.